I've always taken the view from the beginning of this war that Putin is finished.
This guy is losing. He hasn't completely lost yet, but he is in the process of losing. He's got no real friends apart from North Korea and Iran, who are both bleeding him dry anyway.
He's doubled down on everything. He's got no way back. He's burned every bridge that possibly exists behind him. And if I'm wrong about that, if he prevails and if he survives,
the fulcrum changes, the balance changes, and the authoritarians will write the new rules, the rule-based order that will come after that.
The ultra-nationalist side of the Russians are also very critical of the way that Putin has run the war. It could have presented a very serious threat, I think, to Putin's regime.
There is a fragility in the middle of this regime. There's an opportunity here where Putin's regime has got a central weakness on display, and I think we've got to exploit that very carefully and dramatically if necessary.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. And today, in a special edition, we are marking the second anniversary of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Since the 24th of February 2022, tens of thousands of troops have been killed or injured on both sides, with a total figure estimated at 500,000. 22,000 civilians have died and millions have been displaced. It's cost tens of billions of dollars in foreign military aid. And today, the front lines are largely frozen, with Russia occupying around 18% of the country. So, how did we get here? And what next? I'm joined by former NATO Secretary General Lord Robertson, also a former Defence Secretary, Security and Defence Analyst Professor Michael Clark, a leading commentator on the war, and the award-winning documentary maker and journalist Nick Sturdee, who witnessed the annexation of Crimea and has been back and forth to Ukraine ever since. Welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
And Nick, if I can start with you, notwithstanding the Ukrainian forces and civilians, very few people have had a closer experience of the beginnings of Putin's invasion than you. You actually came face to face with Russian paratroopers on the first day. Can you tell us how that happened exactly?
Absolutely. So, like quite a few other journalists, we were in Kiev, me and my colleague Paul Kenyon from the BBC, were in Kiev expecting that something may happen, although there was some kind of doubt. Neither Russians nor Ukrainians I spoke to thought anything of this scale was going to happen. But lo and behold, as we know, on the morning of the 24th of February 2022, it did begin. We heard reports of different rocket attacks on different parts of the country, and the closest one to where we were, in our nice hotel in the centre of Kiev, was Hostomel Airport, which is just to the north of Kiev, as we know. So we hot-footed up there. On the way up there in a car, there were dozens and dozens of cars rushing in the opposite direction. There was a battered old tank that didn't look much use, and we thought that was pretty much what Ukraine's defence was going to look like. And we headed towards Hostomel Airport, and we saw a plume of smoke. And as we approached the base, we saw a small group of armed men, and we all assumed that they were Ukrainian garrison. So we went up to them, we drove up to them, and I wound down the window and I asked in Russian, which at that time anyway was a perfectly normal thing to do, to speak to a Ukrainian. My Ukrainian is weak, but it's getting better. But I said to them in a comical way, I suppose, "Hello, I'm from the BBC. Can I speak?" And when I saw them, they said their answer. They did answer in one word, "Niet." And when I saw them, which didn't necessarily Russian, as I say, but I saw on them these black and orange stripes all the way along their sleeve, which I recognised was the colour of is the emblem of St. George, which is a Russian military medal colour, which became the sort of symbol of the so-called Russian Spring in 2014, and became what Russians or pro-Russians wore as a symbol of, as they saw it, liberation, repeat of World War II, whatever we want to say. So when I saw that I thought, oh my God, they're not Ukrainians at all. And I put my camera down, and obeying their instructions, we got out of there. And behind us, we heard crackle of gunfire, and then we were driven to a downed Russian modern attack helicopter, and we got out to film that, a very old Ukrainian helicopter zoomed in to take a shot at it, which it did very loudly, and it missed. And we got the hell in our car and got the hell out of there. So that and we realised that, my God, this is happening. And this was 10 miles or so from the seat of power in Kiev. And as all of the wise journalists thought, we assumed the whole thing was going to be over in 24, 48 hours, a week at most. And I think most people thought the same kind of thing. But after all the many warnings, to actually see it beginning was quite disturbing for us, and obviously for the locals as well.
Thanks for that, Nick, and I'm really glad that you're here to tell us your story today. Mike, welcome. If you could just cast your mind back, what had Ukraine and its allies been doing militarily to prepare for an invasion?
Well, inevitably not enough, but they were better prepared than people thought at the time. The Allied help to Ukraine had been going on since 2014, but it didn't really get into high gear until really a few months before the invasion. But once it was clear that these military exercises that the Russians were conducting from the late autumn were going over into the new year, and that Putin obviously intended something, or at least to threaten something, then they went into higher gear in terms of helping the Ukrainians plan for some sort of action, which we thought at the time would probably be in the Donbass. Possibly, we thought that maybe they might be so foolish as to try to move westwards from the Donbass and go a little bit further west, somewhere almost as far as Crimea. But we thought that was really unlikely, because it would be such a big move. So there was some planning for that. The Ukrainians did plan to defend themselves in terms of their logistics. They did plan to blow up some of the bridges in the event that didn't all work. But they were a bit better prepared militarily than people thought. Where they weren't very well prepared was that the political messaging was the government seemed to be caught in the headlights. So the Zelensky government kept saying, look, we don't believe this is going to happen. Britain and American intelligence was saying, we're pretty sure it will happen. French intelligence was saying, don't worry, it won't. And the French were completely wrong, and the British and the Americans were completely right. But Zelensky seemed to be buying the French line because it was more palatable. And so there was a sense that the government really waited until it was almost too late, but the military didn't. And so the preparations were not as chaotic on the whole as they seemed to be in the first couple of weeks.
Lord Robertson, thank you for coming back. I know you were here for the first anniversary as well, although I suppose you're not too happy that you have to be here for the second one. Diplomatic 11th hour overtures had been made towards Putin by the French and the German leaders. Can you just set the scene? What geopolitically had led up to this? And at what point do you think the invasion was inevitable?
Well, I met a Russian friend in Edinburgh the November before the invasion took place, who had been the Minister of Defense during my time and was a full member of the Security Council of the Russian Federation. And he said, we are not going to invade. He said, there's a lot of scaremongering, and he said, it's not justified. This is simply muscle flexing. We are not going to invade. Now, this guy has never lied to me before, and I think that's really quite important. Now, he was a member of the Security Council meeting every week with Putin virtually there, because Putin didn't come into the Kremlin. He was scared of the virus. And then various reports came out. I remember going to see Ben Wallace, our Minister of Defense, before he went to Moscow, and I told him how he could get easily trapped there. My own experience, having been in the Kremlin many times, is how they trap you with the theatre of what happens there as well. And I gave him some advice, which he took. The Prime Minister, or the Foreign Minister at the time, Liz Truss, didn't ask me for advice. She walked into the trap. She was humiliated, and the rest is history. So I take the view that it was Putin himself who made the decision, and maybe even at the last minute. He'd assembled all the troops, and certainly he made it look as though he was going to invade, but then that would have been necessary anyway in order to have got the attention that he was getting. But that he probably took the decision at the very last minute to do with it. So who knows? There was a lot of overtures at the last minute to try and persuade him not to do it if it was in his mind. As Michael says, intelligence was saying it looked as if they were going to do it, and they had the troops in order to do it. But I'm still very much of the view that he kept his options open to the last minute, and then he alone made the decision to do it without consulting the full Security Council before the button was actually pressed.
I mean, whether or not he made that decision at the last minute, Mike, that attack on Hostomel airport was part of the Russian plan to take Kyiv. So that plan presumably was there. Why did it fail? And how much of that was down to the fact the Ukrainian forces had already been supplied by with equipment by NATO, like anti-tank missiles, for example?
I mean, it failed because they took Hostomel airport and then were thrown out. And what happened is that the VDV, the Russian airborne forces, they underestimated their enemy. Once they were in the airport, they thought that was it. And then there were problems of the communications. They didn't reinforce quickly or efficiently enough. They had some helicopter problems. And the Ukrainians were able to counterattack quickly enough to take it off them again. Because the idea of Hostomel was that that would be the forward base for the jump into Kyiv in the following 48 hours. So the failure to grab and hold the airport, they grabbed it, but they didn't hold it. And that failure cost them dearly, because that meant that this invasion was actually a sort of military coup more than anything else. It was a governmental coup with military backup. And it either succeeded or failed in the first 72 hours, according to whether they could get to the government, get hold of Zelensky and kill him, plus his family, and then just replace him there and then deal with any problems in the other cities in the coming weeks. But they would only be problems. They wouldn't be real campaigns. And so Hostomel was the jumping off point, and the VDV failed to hold it. And that turned out to be fundamental.
And Nick, when you left the airport, it must have been a very fast-moving situation. Can you describe what it was like to be there and what grasp you had of what was going on elsewhere?
There was very little. So there were various reports of other strikes that had occurred across the country. Really, on our way there, actually, we bumped into a couple of volunteers who come specially in from Lviv in the far west, and were planning to roll their sleeves up and do the best. And I'm still in touch with that guy, and that's what he's done since then. But at the time, as I say, the comparison between the Russian hardware and troops that we saw on the ground and the Ukrainian troops and hardware that we saw on the ground seemed to be very much in the Russians' favor, as we all thought, and as the conventional wisdom was at the time. But of course, after that, the Russians made mistakes. They weren't able to hold Hostomel airport. They had problems, and the Ukrainians were probably better prepared than we'd expected, and they took the airport back. But at the time, still, the sense was that the inevitable was going to happen fairly quickly. And the following day, we walked around Kiev, bumping into the locals. And I remember a conversation with a man who was probably 60-ish. We asked him what he was planning to do if the Russians came in, and he said, "Well, I've got a gun and I'm going to protect my flat." And he didn't look like a military man. And so at that point, we realised that the Russian military were going to be attempting to take over a country and its population that were opposed to it. Certainly in that part, in most of that country. The East is a different question, which maybe we can talk about later if you like. I was there as well when that began in 2014.
Mm-hmm. Lord Robertson, taking into account that if it was starting as a military coup which failed, and Zelensky was clearly not moving, he was staying put, refused the offer of refuge. From the start, though, there did seem to be this reluctance to speedily supply Ukraine with weapons like tanks, F-16 fighter planes, long-range missiles, and that slow delivery and the decision-making, it seems to have dogged the campaign and is continuing to do so till this very day with the stalled US $60 billion aid package, for example. I mean, the last 2 years, they could have looked very differently for Ukraine, couldn't they?
They could and they should, if they'd had the equipment and the ammunition in time and when they wanted it and when they needed it. But there is a reluctance in certain Western capitals, including the White House, about the danger of escalating here, of going too far with the Russians that might provoke them into doing something dire or dramatic. And I think that's the wrong way of looking at it. We should have instilled inside the Russian leadership an idea that they might escalate it too far and get involved in a real, not a mythical war with NATO, which they know only too well they would lose. So it has been one of the characteristics of this whole war that we give them the equipment that they want and need, too late. And we still seem to be going through that. Although it has to be said, remember that the Ukrainians have taken back half the territory that the Russians took in the first stage of the war. The Allies have stayed close together, which was not Putin's expectation, that NATO has grown by 2 neutral countries now joining it, and that the Americans are welded to the Western European again in a way that Vladimir Putin had not anticipated. So, the idea that there is a sort of stalemate at the moment, and that means that the Ukrainians are not winning. It also means that the Russians are not winning, and that Putin has had a dangerous gamble where he has lost maybe 300,000 young people and converted his whole long-term economy into something that will never yet again be the model that he wanted it to be.
Nick, I just want to talk a bit more about your further reporting trips. They took you to the south, to Odessa, Mykolaiv, and then to the east in Slovyansk and Kramatorsk. Can you just tell us a bit more about those trips? When did you go and what was going on at the time?
So the first trip was down to Odessa and Mykolaiv, and that was almost immediately afterwards. So that was sort of the beginning of March, and there was a sense of impending doom, but resilience, I think, amongst both the civilians and the military that had already assumed a position there. In the east, that we went to soon afterwards, to Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, where actually Paul Kenny and I had been in 2014 and 2015, and knew the area quite well. There, it felt that that area is almost on the front line, had been almost on the front line for the best part of 10 years anyway. But there was resilience, but there was a sense amongst both. We spoke to the mayor and we spoke to various civilians, and there was a great deal of trepidation that things were going to start going badly, I think. But at the same time, there were soldiers around, and there were young people mostly, and older people as well, who were determined that they weren't going to allow this happen. So I suppose in some ways it was a repeat of what we'd seen in Hostomel, although we didn't actually see any Russian troops there. But there was a sense that Ukraine and Ukrainians were going to fight, and they did. And the front line hasn't really moved in nearly 2 years. It's moved back and forth a little bit, but generally in that part of the country, it's pretty much where it was before 24th of February 2022.
And I think we should also remember, I think, if I could interrupt just slightly, that Putin put a law through the Parliament of Russia annexing the whole of the Donbass and the whole of these areas. He has not even taken what he formally claimed that he was annexing. So he's not even got the limited objectives that he set out at the beginning. He didn't take Kiev. He didn't decapitate Zelensky's government. He didn't take over the country in 3 days, and he's not even taken the territory that he formally annexed. So, we should recognize that this has not been a success for Russia.
It's refreshing to hear that point of view. And Mike, there are many big moments and have been in this war, both in the ground war and in the air and at sea. Are you able just to give us an overview of what you see as the significant moments of the first 2 years since the full-scale invasion?
Yeah, okay. Well, I'll give you the most significant political moment lasted about 40 seconds. I think it was on the second night when Zelensky came out onto the streets of Kiev with his cabinet, with some members of the cabinet, and he said, they did a little video. It only lasted a few seconds. It was a dangerous place to be. And he said, look, we're here. We're not going anywhere. I'm here. The minister's here. The defense minister's here. The foreign minister's here. We're not going anywhere. And that was so important because it showed the people of Ukraine and the United States and Western Europe that he wasn't going to run away, that they would fight. And that therefore, what we thought would be a sort of a Russian invasion, another version, a bigger version of 2008 or 2014, would actually be a war to defend the country and ultimately a war to liberate the country, we hope. That was a key moment. It lasted only less than a minute. The next big moment, I think you say land, sea and air. Let me think. I mean, on land, I think the biggest moment on land in that first year, certainly, was the withdrawal of the big convoy, the big armored convoy that had gone to the west of Kiev, to the west and the southwest. And we discovered it wasn't even a convoy, it was a traffic jam, because all of these BTGs, these battalion battle tactical groups, had converged on the one road that wasn't mud clogged, and just got jammed up. And we were all thinking, what a strange strategy to have this huge convoy standing still. What are they doing? And of course it wasn't. It was a traffic jam, and it eventually unwound itself and withdrew. And that was a key moment because we realized then that A, they weren't going to take Kiev, they couldn't, and B, that the Russians were making some fundamental errors on the ground, which they've since eliminated quite a lot of, but they were making them then. That was a big ground moment, a ground force moment. Big naval force, I think, is got the sinking of the Moskva in April 2022, not long after the start of the war, because that showed what a country without a navy could do to a country with a navy with some modern technology and some ingenuity. And it set the tone for what has happened since in the naval war, which is that the Ukrainians have been able to keep the Black Sea Fleet out of the Western Black Sea, to force it to withdraw even from Sevastopol, in effect, which is its base and headquarters. Very important symbolism to that. And so I think that was a big moment, the sinking of the Moskva, and very humiliating to lose the flagship, for heaven's sake, to a missile attack and a clever bit of deception. And then in the air, I think it's gone the other way. I'd say that the biggest development in the air is the Russian development of the glide bomb, the Fab 500, as it's called, the FAB 500, because the Russians, adapting as the Ukrainians have done, found a way to increase their air power. They had the Mi-58, they're very good attack helicopters, but they suddenly found that by taking some old bombs, gravity bombs that they had lots and lots of, putting wings on them and a GPS guidance system, they could make those bombs, they could give them a range of 30 or 40 miles, so their aircraft didn't have to tangle with ground defenses or Ukrainian aircraft. They could stand off, drop these bombs from sufficient height for them to glide 30 or 40 miles. And they've been pretty fundamental. They have made life very, very difficult for Ukrainian forces since the beginning of 2023. And so I think in air power, that was probably the single biggest development, which I think has affected the balance.
Can I just open that up to the floor in case anyone wants to add anything else?
Well, I was thinking about the moments of mine. I think the sinking of the Moscow was certainly a deep humiliation for Russia and for Putin as a whole. But the other one was the explosion on the Kerch Bridge. The Kerch Bridge was a Putin project. That linked Crimea to mainland Russia. It cost a huge amount of money, an enormous amount of money, and a civil engineering triumph as well. So, for the explosion there and the disabling of it for at least a period of time was yet again a highly publicized humiliation for this country that was claiming to be a superpower.
And Nick, the counteroffensive in May 2023 was long awaited. There were very high expectations. To what extent do you think the media and the messaging was guilty of fueling those sort of unrealistic expectations, perhaps high on the successes of defending Kyiv, liberating Kherson and Kharkiv, for example?
Well, I should say that I haven't been to Ukraine since 2022 because I was involved in a road traffic accident while working for the BBC, and I'm recovering from a brain injury that I have, so I haven't been there to work.
Sorry to hear that.
Thank you, but of course I've been following it very carefully, and of course there was certainly a sense of imminent victory after the Kharkiv counteroffensive and after the ability to prevent Russia from taking some of the towns in the south. It was considered that that the push would continue, and I must say that in my experience, this isn't the case with all journalists, but journalists, generally speaking, are not experts, and I think that often is conventional wisdom, and that people think a certain thing, and that is the idea that we all have. And I think that being not military experts, everyone thought, well, the tide has turned, and probably that maximize or overestimated the chances of the Ukrainians. I think as well at the same time, all of us perhaps haven't really, in the West or in other countries as well, haven't quite recognized the variety of political view and affiliation within Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine is not a homogenous country. And in 2014 that was the case, and I think perhaps Western countries weren't as attentive to that as they could and should have been. And there has been a sense amongst large parts of the Russian-speaking population, whether they were parts of that were taken over by Russia in 2014 or not, that Kiev was perhaps looked down on the Russian population. I think things have changed, and it's certainly the case that you often hear Russian-speaking Ukrainian soldiers, for sure. So it's not a question that the language you speak defines which side you're on at all. And of course, there are many Russians who, like in Russia itself, who would like their country to be a democratic country and a European country and follow that side of their history. But I think that perhaps we underestimated the fact that in large parts of Ukraine, there was not going to be very much willingness to support the Ukrainian military or the Kiev government. There had been also some sense, even in parts of Ukraine in the east and the centre that weren't taken by the Russians in 2014, there was a bit of, while Zelensky is certainly looked up to across the country, there was a sense, I think, in some of the Russian-speaking areas in the middle of the country that they had hoped that he may, being a Russian speaker himself originally, be able to diffuse the tension with Russia. And of course, that he was up against someone who probably wouldn't have wanted the tension to be diffused. But I think there was a certain amount of disappointment, while there's certainly admiration for Zelensky across the population as a war leader. He's done extremely, he's been extremely successful. But I think as well, as I say, there is a variety of views across Ukraine. So that was one factor, and another factor was, I think, our level of optimism and expectation that things were going to carry on moving the way that we were wrong.
And Mike, why do you think the counteroffensive didn't become the breakthrough that was hoped?
I think a number of reasons. I mean, one is that the offensives we'd seen before in Kharkiv and Kherson were rather special. The Kharkiv one was a surprise, a lot of deception involved, and the Ukrainians were up against very weak Russian troops in that case. And in Kherson, the Russians were just overextended. They were west of the river Dnieper, and they were intended, of course, to go on to Odessa. But because they didn't even get Mykolaiv, they then obviously were not going to go on to Odessa. And they were doing nothing in particular west of the Dnieper. They were just unsustainable. And Sorovikin, a couple of times, tried to withdraw from there, and Putin wouldn't let him. And so the offensive west of the Dnieper, that offensive in Kherson, which was more grinding, was actually up against an enemy that didn't really want to be there. They wanted to get the other side of the river, which is where they are now. So those two offensives that looked so promising, they were good, but they were special. And then you come to the counteroffensive, Ukraine's counteroffensive, and gosh, we waited for it a long time. 2, the Ukrainians didn't have the equipment they needed. 3, they didn't have the time to integrate their equipment and learn in a matter of months the sort of combined arms tactics that we spent years learning, and we expected them to pick it up with new equipment and equipment from all over the world in a matter of months. And because of the time difference, because the offensive didn't start until the 4th of June, the Russians dug defences. And Surovikin, before he fell in the Prigozhin coup, put in the Surovikin line. And these were, minefields that were triple the depth of any minefields that military manuals say are adequate. Triple the depth. And in some cases, there were 3 and 4 mines in 1 square metre. And so, of course, there are always ways across minefields, but they slow you down. And those fixed defences, real Second World War style defences, turned out to be good enough against an attacking force that may have got some of the tactics a little bit wrong, but it was too early for that unit to really go against it. But if you can go back to the English Civil War, the New Model Army, you can go back to Bill Slim's 14th Army, you can go back to the Great Citizen Army of the First World War. Those triumphant armies often found it difficult to begin. They often got pushed back first as they learned on the job how to really integrate and make the best use of their forces. So it's not surprising in a way that they weren't crowned with obvious success. And we shouldn't be too downhearted because some of the greatest armies in military history started that way.
Lord Robertson, the news event that really stunned the world was that march on Moscow by the leader of the Wagner Group, Yevgeny Prigozhin. How precarious a moment was that? Because for a moment, it was unclear who would be leading Russia, a nuclear-armed nation, in the coming hours.
Well, it shouldn't have been, in any way a disturbance to an authoritarian like Putin, because we believe that he has control now of everything. He's got an acquiesced parliament. He's got a Security Council that is in name only, no Politburo, no parliament. And therefore he can do whatever he wants. And he subordinated the military to his command on the face of it. And then suddenly Prigozhin, who was created by Putin, he was his chef to start off with, invented by him, deployed by him, used by him internationally, turns on him and explodes the idea, says that we're not fighting Nazis, and that your military commanders are useless, and marches. Now, in a normal authoritarian regime, a normal dictatorship, you swat people like him away with the back of your hand. The very fact that he was acting in panic at the time and was clearly disturbed by it is an indication about there is a fragility in the middle of this regime that we can't see and that we won't see until something really happens. And I think it's exposed that fragility, and it's something that we need to exploit. He looks at all of the cracks in our democratic societies, wriggles inside them, interferes in elections, targeted assassinations. All of these things are done in order to destabilize the West. So here's an opportunity here where Putin's regime has got a central weakness on display with Prigozhin. And I think we've got to exploit that very carefully and dramatically if necessary.
And how do you do that?
Well, during the Cold War, we managed to get through the Iron Curtain. The Soviet Union was a hermetically sealed unit. People didn't get out, people didn't get in, everything was controlled, and yet we still managed to get messages through. And I think that the downgrading of the BBC World Service and the downgrading of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty and all of the means by which we had in the past used to get the democratic world's message through into the Soviet Union has got to be redeployed now as well in order to undermine the apparent wall that is surrounding Putin at the present moment. And I don't think we are doing nearly enough in the psychological field to make sure that we weaken the regime. We know it's weak because Prigozhin has shown us that there is a weakness in the system. It's up to us now to to magnify that and to utilize it.
And Nick, do you think that President Putin will ever be held to account in the International Criminal Court? Because you worked on hunting Putin's war criminals for Panorama, looking at war crimes. Do you think he'll ever have his day in court?
Well, I think it's very unlikely to. I can't quite see how that would. The only way that that can happen is if the regime collapses in Russia, which may happen, but I find it quite difficult to imagine. I wanted just to add something that George mentioned about the fragility of the Putin regime, which I would agree with. When the Prigozhin uprising or mutiny or whatever you want to call it began, I wondered whether the Wagner militia might join forces, as it were, with the ultra nationalist side of the Russians, who are also very critical of the way that Putin has run the war and that the Ministry of Defense has run the war. And I wonder whether those two sides may find a common voice. And if they had done, fortunately they didn't, if they had done, that could have presented a very serious threat, I think, to Putin's regime. And I think that, again, I'd agree with what George said about getting voices across to the Russian population, because of course Russian propaganda is wall to wall, but people in Russia, of course, remember a period when they accessed lots of other news. People still access YouTube, and there's a thirst for information. And there are some wonderful Russian journalists who sadly have to work mostly from outside the country, but they are operating, and I'm sure there is an audience for the truth and for criticism.
Mike, how secure is President Putin now? Is he emerging as a stronger leader in Russia, and can he rely on his web of allies, China, North Korea, and Iran?
Well, he's certainly more confident at the moment. Whether he's right to be, we're not sure. I mean, I've always taken the view from the beginning of this war that Putin is finished. But whether that finish takes 2 months, 2 years, or 5 years, we just don't know, because he's leading Russia, as George said, into an absolute blind alley. And ultimately, the oligarchs around him won't stay there forever. And he blames everybody else for what goes wrong. He blames the military and the security services for what goes wrong in Ukraine. But he's strutting about at the moment. I mean, the Prigozhin moment was a very difficult moment for him. He's recovered from that. And it is the case that China and Iran and North Korea have kind of thrown in their lot with him. China probably less so, but certainly North Korea and Iran. They've thrown in their lot with Russia on the assumption somehow that Russia will emerge, if not triumphant, at least prevailing in this conflict. And that will be a tipping point for this realignment of world politics. So they're putting their bets on now to the realignment of world politics, which is going towards Russia and China. Now, I'm sure there is a realignment of world politics going on, but I'm not sure it's going to work out in the way that Russia and China would like. And the thing is that the Ukraine war has now become the fulcrum of this realignment, probably for the next decade, which is why it matters way beyond what happens in Ukraine. It's important enough to Ukraine, but it's really important to the rest of us because it has become this fulcrum. And so Putin is, he's doubled down on everything. He's got no way back. He's burned every bridge that possibly exists behind him. And I think he'll be increasingly out on a limb. And if I'm wrong about that, if he prevails and if he survives, then the West is in really, really big trouble.
I very much agree with that. And I think the stakes are really, really high here. And I don't think our Western leadership have really told their populations of just how grave this situation is for them in the future. Because if Putin prevails, then as Mike says, the fulcrum changes, the balance changes, and the authoritarians will write the new rules, the rule-based order that will come after that. So, the stakes are high. But, again, we're facing the prospect, a possibility that Donald Trump wins in America. And the thing about Trump is that he has a tendency to back winners. If he thinks Russia's going to win, then he'll do some deal with them and abandon Ukraine. If he thinks Ukraine is going to win, or he thinks the West is going to win, then he'll want to be on the winning side. And I think, therefore, we need to look very carefully at the balance as it stands at the moment. Russia has been weakened by this adventure, substantially weakened. Its economy is now a war economy. He's moved away from the strong kind of economy that he was producing. The brightest and the best have either been conscripted into the forces and are dead and dying, or they've left the country as a whole. He's got no real friends apart from North Korea and Iran, who are both bleeding him dry anyway over oil prices and the cost of the munitions as well. The old Soviet countries are not on his side. Armenia has just signed up for the International Criminal Court, which means he can't visit Armenia, a close ally of Russia today, and Moldova, Azerbaijan, the Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan give him no real support at all. So, this guy is losing. He hasn't completely lost yet, but he is in the process of losing. And we need to capitalize on that and make sure that people know that that is the case and that the stakes are so high.
And Kate, I mean, I always think that 2024 is going to be like 1942 in the Second World War. I mean, that was a pretty dire year. When the things were in the balance. And, Churchill famously said that before Alamein was in October 1942, he said, before Alamein, never a victory, after Alamein, never a defeat. And 1942 was that fulcrum year in the Second World War. And I think 2024 is just like that in Ukraine. It's a tough year. It will be tough. But somehow we have to try to tip the balance so that the momentum shifts towards Ukraine and the Western world making good on all the grand promises and all the declarations it's made in the last couple of years. We've got to make good on all of that, because this is the 1942 year. It's dire, it's tough, it's tedious, but we've got to get through it.
And what about Ukraine joining NATO, Lord Robertson? Is it going to happen, and when? And it's largely seen as Ukraine's long-term security guarantees, so presumably in your eyes, imperative.
Well, it's a process. They will eventually become members of NATO and of the European Union. I think it's worth pointing out that this whole crisis started developing when the European Union offered President Yanukovych of Ukraine at the time an association agreement. He was told by the Kremlin to reject it. The Maidan demonstrations took place. He was overthrown. So this crisis developed not from NATO membership, but from EU membership as well. And that's now beginning to progress, quite seriously. And that will have a major impact on Ukraine as a whole. You can't take in a country that is at war already. And, I think we, in NATO, the sort of conditions that have been laid down in advance for countries coming in would sort of preclude that. But they're getting as close as possible to NATO as any country could possibly be. And at the 75th anniversary summit that'll take place in Washington in July, they will be given an enhanced position that will effectively make them, the 33rd member of the alliance, even if membership is going to happen until success is achieved in the battlefield.
Nick, as the war goes into its third year, tensions are bound to rise in a country fighting for its very existence, and there are bound to be differences of opinion between military leaders and politicians, as has been reported widely. How secure do you think public support is for President Zelensky, the government, compared to that of the military?
Well, Zelensky has outperformed the expectations that I think the entire population had of him, for sure, and obviously across the world, he's very much impressed governments and populations. That said, he is viewed, I think, generally somebody who has functioned better as a war leader than as a politician. and there are his perhaps Achilles heel is the fact that there are meant to be presidential elections this year, and it doesn't look like, well, there's no date for them yet anyway. So I think that the more criticism that comes of him, the more problems there may be. General Zaluzhny has ridden above criticism of other people in the military leadership for corruption and for failings. I think he's generally seen amongst the military and amongst the population as somebody who's done a very formidable job. So, and there are also, there are new views being expressed. For example, Zelensky's former aide, Alexei Arestovich, is talking about ways forward, ways to stop the war. He's talking about maybe trying to entering NATO, and then talking about what's going to happen to some of the territories that have been taken by Russia already. So I think there is debate, and Zelensky, he may have difficulty continuing to be the sole force in Ukrainian politics, which may not be a bad thing, of course.
And Mike, now that General Zaluzhny has been replaced by Alexander Syrsky, could you tell us how much of an impact that is likely to have on the direction of the war?
I don't think it'll have that much impact on the ground in the war itself, because Syrsky is the land forces commander, and so he's stepping up to be commander in chief. And although that's a fairly big step up for him, he's stepping up 2 places. He's going above the chief of the general staff to be commander in chief. Nevertheless, that brings continuity, and Syrsky is the man who masterminded the offensives in Kharkiv and Kherson. So, I mean, he has a good pedigree in that respect. The interest of the replacement, Zaluzhny for Syrsky, is really in the politics of it. I mean, Zaluzhny, as it were, stepping into a different role, but not stepping out of the tent altogether, is very important, because President Zelensky has got to keep unity among his team. And it's not unreasonable. I mean, generals often get replaced in wartime for various reasons. And given where the Ukrainians are now militarily, and the almost certain loss of Avdiivka, that it's not unreasonable that you take a general out of the equation and put another general in, because you may want to change the tactics or encourage a change of tactics a little bit. More than anything, Zelensky says he wants generals who are a bit more can-do, a bit more aggressive, whereas Zaluzhny was very competent. But I think Zelensky thought that he was a bit too conservative in his military judgments. Most other people thought Zaluzhny got it about right. So there may be a change in tone politically, but this represents a degree of continuity in a military sense. Well, countries often replace their generals during wars. It's not that abnormal. And interestingly, Zaluzhny looks as if he's going to be kept in the tent, as it were, if he stays, rather than go into some sort of opposition role, which would be very negative. So that sort of rotation is not so unusual. But clearly, Zelensky had a political problem that's been building since before Christmas, and he had to address this problem to solidify his own leadership for certainly the next 12 months, and convince the outside world that the anti-corruption policies that he's adopting are still going to work their way through. And I mean, Zaluzhny was never identified as somebody who was corrupt, but there is a sense that the failure of the offensive and the problems in Avdiivka, in a sense, are laid at the door of the commander in chief, and that's not inappropriate. Even though Zaluzhny is certainly a very good man, and you don't rule out the fact that him taking another command role at some other stage in the war.
And Lord Robertson, just finally, this is a huge year. Elections in at least 64 countries around the world, a conflict in the Middle East, concerns over the security of Taiwan. Is this also the year when Ukraine's future will also be decided?
Well, we don't know, and we won't know until we do know. And it is going to be an important year for them in any event, because keeping together the coalition of support, the Americans with their elections coming up, the Europeans with some new factors applying here, Viktor Orban taking over the traces, the Slovakian government being more pro-Russian than the previous government was. All of these things are in play. So the year is going to be complicated and difficult to predict. But I think gradually people are beginning to realise, we had a speech from last week from President Macron, just about how important it is to the population of the rest of Europe and indeed the world, what is happening in Ukraine today. So we need to keep our eye fixed very clearly on the objective of making sure that Putin doesn't win and that the Ukrainians get back the territory that they've lost to Russia. The stakes are hugely high, and this year might well be a determining year in terms of what happens there and then what happens to the rest of the world as a consequence.
George Robertson, Lord Robertson, Professor Michael Clark and Nick Sturdee, thank you so much for your time. You've been watching a special edition of Frontline for Times Radio to mark the second anniversary of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. You can support us now by subscribing or go to thetimes.co.uk. My thanks to all of our guests, to our producer Louis Sykes, and to you for watching. Bye-bye for now.